Caesar's war narrative is how Julius Caesar conquered Rome with sentences. And it sounds so objective that you don't notice it rewriting the Republic. Most people hear propaganda and picture shouting, posters, and obvious lies. Julius Caesar's weapon was the opposite, a calm, almost clinical style that feels like objective reporting, right as it pushes you exactly where Caesar wants you to go. In this episode, we'll break down Caesar's commentary, his famous war commentaries, and expose 3 tactics hiding in plain sight: third-person framing, moral justification, and enemy portrayal. They sound like dry reporting. In reality, they manufacture legitimacy. Stick with this to the end, because once you see Caesar's playbook, you'll understand how Octavian later used the same moves to sell a war against Cleopatra as a war for Rome's soul. Rome was loud, politics was loud, the Forum was loud. Candidates practically lived in crowds, shaking hands, promising everything. And then Julius Caesar publishes something that reads like it was written by a man who never raises his voice. These works are usually called the commentari, commentaries. They cover Caesar's campaigns in Gaul and the later civil war. But calling them commentaries can be misleading, because they aren't private notes or a diary. They are crafted narratives released into a political world where reputation is power. Here's what made this so effective. While Caesar was away in Gaul, Rome didn't stop talking about Caesar. Rome argued about Caesar at dinner parties. Rome argued about Caesar in the Senate. Rome argued about Caesar in court. And distance is dangerous. If you're not in the city to defend yourself, your enemies can paint your actions any color they want. They can say, Caesar is massacring people for profit. Caesar is starting wars to look heroic. Caesar is hoarding wealth to buy elections. Caesar is training an army that will one day march on Rome. Now imagine you are Caesar. You can't be everywhere, you can't answer every rumor, you can't personally persuade every voter. So Caesar sends a surrogate version of himself, his voice on a page. Caesar published the Commentarii in a transformed literary form, and he did so for propagandistic purposes. Not propaganda in the cartoon sense, propaganda as a deliberate attempt to shape public judgment. That is the thesis of this episode. The story of Caesar's wars was not just battlefield reporting. It helped justify extraordinary power in a politically volatile moment. So Caesar invents something smarter, a narrative that sounds neutral, reasonable, almost boring, until you realize it's turning the reader into a juror who keeps voting, Caesar is right. If you stick with this, you'll learn the 3 tactics behind that effect. Third-person framing, the illusion of an objective report. Moral justification, turning force into duty, enemy portrayal, making opposition feel unreasonable, and once you see them, you'll start noticing the same tricks everywhere, from political speeches to modern press releases. Before we break them down, one quick reminder of why Caesar's words mattered so much. Caesar's Gallic campaigns didn't end as a minor border patrol. They ended with massive victories, including the defeat of Vercingetorix at Alesia, one of the most famous turning points of the conquest of Gaul. That success gave Caesar a mountain of prestige in Rome. Prestige in Rome was not just applause, it was leverage. It meant allies wanted to stand near you. It meant voters believed you were chosen by the gods. It meant rivals feared you, and it meant your soldiers, your veterans, became part of your legend. But prestige also creates panic. The Roman Republic was run by an elite circle of families that guarded power like a family heirloom. A general who became too popular looked like a threat to the whole system. So Caesar's success created 2 forces at once. It boosted Caesar's claim to leadership, It increased the desire of rivals to cut Caesar down. This is why the Civil War era reshaped the Republic. Caesar's political positioning and personal narrative were central to his rise, not just his battlefield skill. In a world where courts could destroy a man and senators could declare someone an enemy, the story about you could be as important as the army behind you. Now let's talk about the first tactic, because it's the one that makes everything else work. And keep listening, because the second tactic is where the objective report becomes a moral trap for the reader. If you expect Julius Caesar to write, "I did this, I did that," you'll be surprised. The Gallic War is written largely in the third person, something even modern public domain readings and notes like the LibriVox material highlight, because it creates that objective report vibe. Instead of "I marched," you get "Caesar marched." Instead of "I decided," you get "Caesar decided." That small choice does something powerful to the reader's brain. It creates distance. It makes the narrative feel like it's being told by an outside observer, like a staff officer filing a report, like a man who is too busy being responsible to brag. And that objective report vibe is exactly the point. Caesar is presenting himself as a fact, not a salesman. Imagine you're a Roman citizen reading this. You're not on the battlefield. You don't see the mud, the blood, the panic, the terrified civilians. You see words. Third-person narration quietly invites you to take the role of a judge. It whispers, you are not being persuaded. You are evaluating evidence. So Caesar hands you evidence in clean, orderly sequences. A threat appears. Caesar gathers information. Caesar offers terms or a warning. The enemy refuses or misbehaves. Caesar acts. The outcome proves Caesar was correct. Even when Caesar makes a bold move, the third-person voice can describe it as if it were the only rational option left. That matters in Rome because Rome is obsessed with dignitas, personal dignity and status and auctoritas, the kind of authority people feel in their bones. If Caesar sounds calm and controlled, Caesar sounds legitimate. There's another sneaky advantage. Repeating Caesar over and over in third person turns the name into a brand. Not in a flashy way, in a subtle way. It's like reading a report that keeps saying, "The commander did this, the commander decided that." The reader absorbs the idea that Caesar is the central organizing force of events. And because Caesar is named so often, the reader remembers Caesar. The name sticks. The name becomes the anchor of the story. That is how propaganda can work without slogans. Repetition inside neutral reporting. Strategic honesty Caesar's commentaries can include setbacks and mistakes, but usually in a controlled way. This is another classic technique. Admit something small so the rest feels trustworthy. If a narrative never admits problems, readers suspect it's a fairy tale. If a narrative admits a few problems and then explains how the leader solved them, the leader looks more competent, not less. So even a setback can become a sales pitch for leadership. The situation was difficult. Caesar responded. Order was restored. The no emotion advantage. Third person also hides emotion. That's important because emotion is what opponents accuse you of. Anger, ambition, greed. In Roman political language, those are deadly accusations. A narrative that sounds emotionally flat can pass as honest. Caesar's style often feels like these are simply the facts. And once the reader accepts that tone, Caesar can slip in persuasion without ever raising the volume. A style built to travel. There's also the prose itself. people have long noted how simple and direct Caesar's Latin is. That clarity is a major reason Caesar's writings became a cornerstone of Latin education for centuries, a point often repeated in learner-friendly discussions and readings, including LibriVox's commentary on why Caesar is so teachable. Even in Caesar's own lifetime, that simple style had a political advantage. A clean style is easy to repeat, easy to summarize to a friend in the baths, easy to read aloud at a dinner party, and reading aloud mattered. Rome was a society where elite households and political circles shared texts by performance. A work that could be read smoothly without getting tangled spread faster. In Rome, a message that travels wins. At this point, here's the key takeaway. Third-person framing makes propaganda feel like reporting. Now watch what Caesar does next, because the objective report is only the shell. Inside the shell, Caesar builds morality. If this is clicking for you, don't drift away, because the ending shows how Octavian took Caesar's calm reporting style and turned it into a weapon that could destroy Cleopatra's reputation without ever meeting Cleopatra face to face. The morality mask, turning force into duty. War is ugly. Romans knew that. They also knew that Romans loved victory. So the real challenge isn't to describe war. The challenge is to make the reader feel that war was required. Caesar does this by building a moral frame around his actions, without preaching. Instead of Caesar wanted to conquer, the narrative becomes Caesar had to respond. Instead of Caesar chose violence, the narrative becomes Caesar prevented worse violence. This is a classic Roman moral posture. The good leader is not hungry for war. The good leader carries war like a burden. Necessity, not desire. Caesar often presents conflict as something forced on him by circumstances or by the enemy. A tribe threatens allies. A rival breaks an agreement. A sudden movement endangers Roman citizens. A frontier becomes unstable. Then Caesar acts, quickly, decisively, but framed as reluctant necessity. This matters because Rome is politically paranoid. Romans fear kings. Romans fear personal ambition. Romans fear the general who comes home too powerful. So Caesar needs the reader to believe Caesar's power is not personal. It is functional. It is a tool used on behalf of Rome. In other words, Caesar isn't building a private empire. Caesar is solving problems. Caesar's moral frame leans on ideas Romans respected. Fides means trustworthiness, keeping promises and agreements. Pietas means duty, doing what is right for gods, family and country. Clementia means mercy, showing restraint when you have the power to crush someone. You don't need to memorize those words, you just need to see the strategy. Caesar wants to look like the man who honors duty, keeps order, and restrains himself. That's the version of a leader Romans wanted to believe in, especially when politics felt like it was spinning out. One of Caesar's most powerful moral moves is to present himself as the protector of others, allies, Roman citizens, and the basic order of the frontier. If Caesar is protecting, then Caesar's violence becomes defensive, even when Caesar is deep inside foreign territory. It's the same logic you can see in later imperial language. The empire doesn't conquer, the empire pacifies. The empire doesn't invade, the empire restores stability. Caesar's commentaries are an early masterclass in that logic. Caesar also uses details, routes, distances, supplies, troop numbers, as moral cover. When you focus the reader on logistics, you distract from moral horror. A village burned becomes a necessary measure to deny supplies. A harsh punishment becomes a corrective example. A massacre becomes an unfortunate result of resistance. The reader isn't asked to celebrate cruelty. The reader is asked to admire efficiency. And this is where Caesar's objective report style becomes so dangerous, because efficiency feels ethical when the tone is calm. Put all this together and Caesar becomes a character type, the crisis manager. He appears to handle chaos that other men created. He seems to restore order when others panic. He seems to move first, think clearly, and accept responsibility. That persona is political gold in a republic in permanent crisis. Because Rome wasn't stable. Factional violence had become normal. Senators used courts like clubs. Street politics could turn into riots. Ordinary citizens feared disorder and shortages, so a leader who could say, "I bring order," had an audience ready to believe him. This is why the story of Caesar's wars mattered. It didn't just entertain, it justified a new kind of power. Extended commands, personal loyalty from soldiers, and eventually the leap from republic politics into civil war politics. Now we turn to the third tactic, the one that makes opponents feel like obstacles instead of humans. Because when Caesar portrays the enemy a certain way, the reader doesn't just accept Caesar's actions. The reader starts wanting Caesar to win. Caesar's enemies in the commentaries are not usually described as brave equals. They are often portrayed as one of three things: unreliable, they break agreements and shift positions; irrational, they act from panic or pride instead of reason; dangerous, they threaten allies, civilians, and stability. This isn't done with obvious name-calling, it's done through structure. A common pattern is Caesar offers terms, the enemy rejects or deceives, then Caesar punishes. The effect is subtle. The reader learns to expect that the enemy will force Caesar to respond. Caesar becomes the reasonable party. Resistance becomes stubbornness. This is especially useful in a war of conquest. Conquest is hard to justify morally. But punishing treachery and defending allies, that's easy to justify in Roman political language. Caesar also knows what Romans fear. Romans feared disorder. Romans feared raids. Romans feared instability on the frontier. Romans also feared the unknown, especially large movements of people. So when Caesar describes certain enemies as unpredictable, fierce, or threatening, it doesn't just explain a battle. It activates the reader's fear and turns Caesar into the solution. This is propaganda that works through emotion while pretending to be unemotional. Caesar also splits opponents into categories. Some groups are framed as misguided but salvageable. Others are framed as direct threats. This gives Caesar a flexible moral toolkit. Caesar can be merciful when it benefits him and harsh when it benefits him, and both can be presented as consistent policy. Mercy becomes proof of Caesar's restraint. Harshness becomes proof of Caesar's responsibility. Either way, Caesar looks like the adult. Enemy leaders can be portrayed as prideful, reckless, or manipulative, men who drag their people into disaster. This is where the Vercingetorix story becomes a perfect narrative engine. The siege of Alesia is dramatic on its own. Walls counter walls, desperate relief forces. But in Caesar's hands it becomes something more, a moral demonstration. Alesia becomes proof that even when the enemy unites, Caesar can outthink, outwork, and outlast. To Romans reading at home, that's more than a victory report. It's a resume line written in blood. Caesar defeated the greatest threat. Therefore Caesar deserves honor. Therefore Caesar deserves office. Therefore Caesar deserves trust. Now here's the key twist. Caesar isn't only portraying foreign enemies. The same habits, third-person objectivity, moral justification, enemy framing, become even more explosive when Caesar applies them to Roman rivals during the Civil War. Because then Caesar isn't just saying, these tribes were dangerous. Caesar is saying, my Roman opponents were unreasonable. They forced my hand. I acted for the good of the state. In a republic, that is dynamite. It turns civil war into self-defense. It turns rebellion into duty. It turns Caesar's personal struggle into Rome's struggle. Octavian's messaging often spoke with the voice of Rome, not the voice of Octavian. That is the same psychological trick as Caesar's third-person framing. It creates distance and a sense of objectivity. When you speak as if you are not selling, you sound like reality. Octavian framed his wars as necessary for restoring order, avenging wrongs, and protecting Roman values. That is Caesar's moral justification tactic scaled up. Violence becomes duty, duty becomes legitimacy, legitimacy becomes authority. And here is where Cleopatra enters. Octavian would later perfect enemy portrayal by turning Cleopatra into a symbol. Foreign, seductive, dangerous, a threat to Roman identity. The goal wasn't only to defeat Cleopatra militarily. The goal was to make Cleopatra morally unacceptable to Roman audiences. Because if Cleopatra is framed as a threat to Rome's values, then war against Cleopatra becomes not just strategic, it becomes righteous. That is Caesar's enemy portrayal tactic, used at a higher level of sophistication. Octavian didn't merely fight opponents. Octavian turned them into narratives that made fighting them feel inevitable. So what changed Rome? Not just that Caesar won battles, Caesar taught Rome's elite a lesson. Control the narrative, and you control the definition of legitimacy. By publishing the Commentarii in a crafted, report-like form, explicitly for propagandistic purposes, Caesar made it possible to sell extraordinary power as ordinary reason. By writing largely in the third person, Caesar created the illusion of objectivity. By framing force as necessity, Caesar turned violence into duty. By portraying enemies as unreasonable and dangerous, Caesar made opposition feel like a problem, not a perspective. And because Caesar's prose was simple and direct, it spread, and then it survived, becoming a cornerstone of Latin education and giving Caesar's voice a cultural afterlife that outlived the Republic itself. In the end, the most important battleground wasn't Gaul or Italy, it was the reader's mind. Now that you've seen how Julius Caesar shaped the story of war, let's watch Julius Caesar do the impossible on the battlefield Alesia, where Julius Caesar fought outnumbered 5-1 and still won.